Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to share a story that has stayed with me longer than I expected, not because of its battles or its gods or even its kings, but because of a question it quietly leaves behind. What if the strongest man who ever lived was still afraid? I remember the first time I came across the name Gilgamesh, a king, a giant, two-thirds god, a man who could build cities, conquer enemies, and command the fate of thousands with a single word. At first, I thought this would be a story about power, about greatness, about what it means to rise above everyone else. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. Because the story didn't begin with glory. It began with fear. Across the vast plains of ancient Mesopotamia, where the rivers carved life into the earth, there stood a city unlike any other. Its walls stretched so far they seemed to touch the horizon. Its towers rose so high they felt as if they were reaching for the heavens. This was Uruk, a place of beauty, ambition, and human achievement. And at its center sat a king who had everything. And yet, something was missing. I kept wondering, how could someone so powerful become someone his own people prayed to be saved from? How does a man go from being chosen by the gods to being feared like a storm that never ends? And maybe more importantly, if someone like him could lose his way, what about us? This isn't just the story of a king, it's the story of what happens when strength goes too far, when ambition blinds us, and when life forces us to face something no one can escape. Because somewhere along this journey, a friend will appear, a life will be lost, and a question will rise that even gods cannot answer. What does it mean to live, knowing that one day everything ends? I didn't expect to care about this story, but at some point, it stopped feeling like history and started feeling personal. So tonight, I'm not just going to tell you what happened. I want to explore it with you, step by step, question by question, and maybe somewhere along the way, we'll both find something we weren't looking for. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, let the noise of the world fade away, and together let's step into a city of stone and silence where a king once believed he could conquer everything, except what was waiting for him all along. I still remember the first time I heard the name Gilgamesh. It didn't sound like a man's name, it sounded like something heavier, something older, like a force rather than a person. And the more I listened, the more I realized this wasn't just a king. This was someone people described as two-thirds God, a ruler whose strength stood above every warrior, whose presence alone could silence a room. And I couldn't help but lean closer into the story because there's something about power like that, something that pulls you in before you even understand it. They said he ruled a city called Uruk, a place so vast its walls stretched farther than the eye could see, a city built from ambition, from stone, from the will of a man who refused to be ordinary. And as I pictured it in my mind, I could almost see those towering walls catching the last light of the sun, almost hear the echo of footsteps along its streets, and at the center of it all, him, a king who seemed untouchable, unstoppable, almost divine. And I'll be honest with you, at that moment, I wasn't questioning anything yet. I wasn't thinking about consequences or balance or what power might cost. No, I was drawn in completely. Because a part of me wondered, what would it feel like to be that strong, to stand above everyone else, to never have to fear anything? And maybe that's where it begins. Not with wisdom, not with doubt, but with fascination. Because it was before I ever saw the cracks in his story, before I understood what was coming, I was just like anyone else hearing his name for the first time, captivated by the idea of a man who seemed greater than human. And I didn't realize yet that this story wasn't going to show me how powerful he was. It was going to show me why even someone like him could never escape what was waiting ahead. But the longer I stayed with that image, the more something began to feel off. Not all at once, not in a way that was obvious, but like a quiet discomfort that slowly grows when you start noticing the details people don't talk of, because behind those towering walls of Uruk, behind the image of strength and greatness, There were voices, quieter voices, the kind that don't get recorded in legends, the kind that speak in fear. And I began to hear them. They spoke of men forced into endless labor, building monuments that reached for the sky, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. They spoke of young men taken from their homes, sent into wars that never seemed to end, not for survival, but for the ambition of a king who refused to be satisfied. And there were whispers, softer still, of families who lived in constant fear, of daughters who were no longer safe simply because the king desired control over everything. And that's when it started to change for me, because the story I thought was about greatness was beginning to look like something else entirely, something heavier, something harder to accept. And I found myself asking a question I couldn't ignore. If a man has everything, power, strength, a city that worships him, then why does he need to take even more? Why does he need to control, to dominate, to push his people until they can barely breathe? And I couldn't find an easy answer, because part of me didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that someone who stood so high above everyone else could also be the reason so many were suffering below. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Power doesn't always make a person greater. Sometimes it just reveals who they already are, and that realization stayed with me, quiet, unsettling, because it forced me to look at the story differently, not as a tale of a godlike king, but as the beginning of something far more complicated, something far more human, and maybe even something a little too familiar. And the deeper I went into the story, the more I began to notice something that stayed with me long after I stopped reading. It wasn't the strength of the king, it wasn't the grandeur of the city, it was the silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to hang over Uruk like a shadow that never moved, because this wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It was the kind that comes when people are afraid to speak, when every word feels like a risk, when even thoughts are kept hidden. And I could almost imagine it, walking through those wide streets, seeing merchants who once laughed, now speaking in hushed voices, glancing over their shoulders, lowering their eyes whenever the name of the king was mentioned, as if even the air itself might carry their words back to him. And that image stayed with me, because it didn't feel like a city ruled by greatness. It felt like a city holding its breath, waiting, enduring, hoping something would change. And then I started to notice the smaller moments, the ones that rarely make it into grand stories. A mother holding her child a little closer than usual, not because of danger from outside the walls, but because of the man who ruled within them. A father who avoided the main roads, not out of laziness, but out of fear of being taken. Forced into labor, into war, into something he didn't choose. And it made me pause, because this wasn't the kind of power I had imagined at the beginning. This wasn't strength that protected. This was something else entirely. Something that pressed down on people, something that took more than it gave. And I kept thinking about the people, what it must feel like to live in a place where even hope becomes quiet, where you don't shout for change, you whisper it, where you don't expect justice, you pray for it. And that's when the story shifted again, because those whispers, those quiet fears, didn't stay on the ground. They rose, slowly, steadily, carried by something deeper than words. And I could see it in my mind, temples filled with flickering light, priests standing before the altars, voices low but desperate, calling out not to a king, but to something beyond him, something greater, something that might finally listen. They weren't asking for wealth or victory or glory. They were asking for relief, for balance, for someone, anyone, to restore what had been lost and lost. And there was something about that moment that felt incredibly human to me, because when people can no longer turn to those who rule them, they look upward. They look beyond, searching for something that still feels just. And I couldn't help but wonder, how far does a ruler have to fall before his own people stop seeing him as a protector and start seeing him as something they need protection from? And that question lingered, quiet but persistent, because it wasn't just about Gilgamesh anymore. It was about the nature of power itself, about how easily admiration can turn into fear, how quickly respect can become silence. And I found myself asking something I hadn't expected to ask at the beginning of this story, something simple but difficult to answer. If strength creates fear instead of safety, if power takes more than it gives, then is it really something worth desiring, or is it just another form of emptiness disguised as greatness? And I didn't have an answer yet, but I could feel it, slowly forming, somewhere beneath the surface, waiting, just like the people of Uruk, for something to finally change. And then, somewhere between those whispered prayers and that heavy silence hanging over the city, I began to feel it. Not something you could see, not something anyone said out loud, but a shift. Subtle, almost invisible, like the air just before a storm, when everything is still, but nothing feels calm, because something is coming. And even if you don't know what it is, you know it won't leave things the same. And I kept thinking about those voices rising from Uruk, those quiet pleas carried beyond the walls, beyond the towers, beyond even the reach of the king himself. Because there's a point, I think, when human suffering stops being just a human problem, when it becomes something larger, something that echoes into places we don't fully understand. And in the story, that's exactly what happens. The cries of the people don't disappear. They reach the heavens. They reach the ones who were supposed to have placed order into the world. And for the first time, I started to imagine what that moment might have felt like, not from the ground, but from above, looking down at a city that was once full of life, now weighed down by fear. Looking at a king who was given strength not just to rule, but to guide, and realizing something had gone wrong, deeply wrong. And I found myself wondering, at what point do the ones who give power decide to take a closer look at how it's being used? At what point do they step in? Not to punish, but to restore balance. Because that's what this moment felt like. Not revenge, not anger, but correction. Like something in the universe quietly refusing to let things drift too far out of place. And the more I sat with that idea, the more it unsettled me. Because it suggested something I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. That no matter how strong someone becomes, no matter how far they rise above others, there is still a line unseen, but real. And once it's crossed, something shifts, something responds. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in a way we expect, but eventually, inevitably. And that thought stayed with me because it didn't just apply to kings, it applied to everything. To ambition, to control, to the quiet ways people justify going just a little further than they should. And I started to feel that tension building in the story, like a thread being pulled tighter and tighter, knowing it can't hold forever. Because somewhere beyond the sight of the people, beyond even the awareness of the king himself, a decision is being made, a balance is being restored, and I could almost sense the moment approaching, when that unseen force would take shape, when something would enter the world, not by chance, but by design, created for a purpose, to challenge, to confront, to change everything that had been allowed to continue for too long. And it made me pause because I realized this wasn't just the beginning of a new chapter in the story. This was the moment where consequences begin to take form, where actions that once seemed untouchable it start to ripple outward. And I couldn't help but think, maybe no one ever truly escapes that. Maybe no one can keep taking, pushing, controlling without something eventually pushing back. And as I sat with that thought, quiet, unsettled, I found myself returning to a single idea, one that felt simple, but carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Maybe, just maybe, no one can go too far without eventually having to pay the price. And it was right there, in that quiet moment before everything changed, that the story introduced someone I had never expected. Not a king, not a warrior trained in battle, not someone shaped by power or ambition, but something far more unusual. something almost untouched by the world as we know it. Because while Gilgamesh stood at the center of a city built by human hands, this new figure would be born far away from walls, far away from control, in a place where nothing was forced, nothing was commanded. And for the first time, I began to sense that this wasn't just another character being added to the story. This was an answer, a response, something created not by chance, but with intention. And I found myself wondering, what does the world create when it needs to restore balance? And the answer was Enkidu. They say he was formed from clay, shaped by divine hands, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate. Every movement guided by a purpose that went beyond human understanding, and I tried to picture it. The earth itself giving rise to a man, not born into a family, not raised by society, but emerging directly from the ground, carrying with him something raw, something untouched. And there was something about that image that stayed with me. Because it felt pure, in a way that was almost difficult to describe. No expectations, no ambition, no need to prove anything, just existence, simple, complete, whole. And as I thought about Gilgamesh surrounded by gold, by power, by endless desire for more, I couldn't ignore the contrast because Enkidu was none of those things. He didn't command, he didn't control, he didn't seek to dominate anything around him. Instead, he lived among the animals, moved with them, drank from the same rivers, rested beneath the same sky. And I found myself drawn to that idea more than I expected, a man who didn't need to rise above others because he was already enough. And that thought lingered with me because it raised a quiet question, one I hadn't considered at the beginning. What if strength isn't about power at all? What if it's about not needing it? And the more I sat with that contrast, the more it unsettled me in a different way, because it forced me to look at Gilgamesh again, not just as someone who had everything, but as someone who had lost something without realizing it, something Enkidu still carried effortlessly, something simple, something human. And I think that's when it truly began to shift for me, because I stopped seeing this as a story about two men who would eventually meet and started seeing it as something else entirely, a collision between two ways of existing, one shaped by power, the other untouched by it. And I couldn't help but wonder, what happens when those two worlds finally come face to face? Which one changes the other? Or maybe they both do. And as that thought settled in, quiet, steady, I realized something that felt almost certain. This wasn't just the introduction of a new character. This was the beginning of the moment everything had been building toward. Because sometimes when something in the world goes too far, it doesn't get destroyed, it gets balanced. And Enkidu was that balance, a man who carried something Gilgamesh no longer had, a kind of strength that didn't come from power, but from being completely free of it. And I couldn't look away anymore because now I needed to see what would happen next. And the more I stayed with Enkidu, the more I began to realize that his life wasn't just different from Gilgamesh's. It was almost the complete opposite, because while one ruled over walls of stone and voices of obedience, the other moved through open land where nothing was forced, nothing was owned, nothing was controlled. And I tried to slow down to really see it, to imagine what it must have felt like to wake each day without expectation, without duty, without anyone telling you who you were supposed to be. Because Enkidu didn't walk through crowded streets or sit upon a throne, he ran through fields where the grass bent beneath his feet. He drank from clear rivers that carried no command, only life. He rested beneath trees that offered shade without asking for anything in return. And there was something almost unsettling about that kind of existence, not because it was harsh, but because it was simple, so simple that it made everything else feel unnecessarily complicated. And I found myself wondering, when was the last time any of us experienced something like that? A moment untouched by expectation, untouched by pressure, untouched by the quiet weight of becoming something more. And the longer I thought about it, the more I began to see what made Enkidu truly powerful. It wasn't just his strength, it was his absence of need. He didn't seek recognition, he didn't crave control, he didn't measure himself against anyone else. He simply existed, fully, naturally, without questioning whether he was enough. And that realization stayed with me longer than I expected, because it made me look back at Gilgamesh in a way I hadn't before. A king who had everything, yet was constantly reaching for more, building higher, conquering further, pushing beyond every limit, as if something inside him refused to rest, refused to be satisfied. And I couldn't ignore the contrast anymore, because Enkidu had nothing, and yet seemed complete, while Gilgamesh everything, and still wasn't at peace. And that's when the question began to take shape more clearly in my mind. Not loud, not urgent, but persistent. What if the thing we spend our lives chasing isn't what we actually need? What if the more we gain, the more we lose something we don't even realize is slipping away? And I began to feel that quiet tension again, the kind that doesn't come from conflict, but from realization. Because Enkidu wasn't just living a different life, he was showing something that had been forgotten, something buried beneath ambition and control and the endless need to prove ourselves. A way of being that didn't require domination, didn't require comparison, didn't require anything at all. And I think that's when it truly settled in for me, not as a thought, but as a feeling, that maybe, just maybe, what Gilgamesh had lost wasn't power, wasn't control, but something far more difficult to name, something softer, quieter, something that can't be built or conquered, only lived. And the more I sat with that idea, the more I understood why Enkidu had to exist. Because sometimes when someone rises too far above everything else, they don't need to be destroyed. They need to be reminded of what it means to be human. As I let that thought linger, slow, steady, slutty, I realized something that made this story feel even more real, because this wasn't just about a king and a wild man. This was about two ways of living, one that takes and one that simply is, and somewhere between those two lies something we all keep searching for, whether we realize it or not. And then, just when I thought I had begun to understand Enkidu, the story shifted again. Not suddenly, not violently, but in a way that felt almost quiet, almost gentle, like the beginning of something you don't fully recognize until it has already changed you. Because up until that moment, Enkidu existed outside of everything we call human, outside of language, outside of rules, outside of the invisible structures that shape how we think and feel. And part of me wondered if that was what made him whole. What would happen if that changed? What would be gained? And more importantly, what would be lost? And that's when she appeared, Shamhat, not as a force, not as a warrior, but as something entirely different, something soft, something human. And I remember pausing there because it felt strange that the turning point in the life of someone so powerful would begin not with conflict, but with connection. She approached him slowly, carefully, not with fear, but with understanding. And for the first time, Enkidu encountered something he had never known before, another kind of presence, not animal, not instinct, but something layered, something emotional, something that reached beyond survival. And I tried to imagine what that must have felt like for him, to look into the eyes of another human being, to feel curiosity instead of instinct, to sense something awakening that had no name yet. And that moment, quiet as it was, changed everything, because from there the transformation began. Not all at once, but step by step, breath by breath. He was introduced to bread, something created, not found. He tasted it hesitantly, unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. And then came the drink, the warmth spreading through him, not just in his body, but somewhere deeper, somewhere he hadn't known existed. And I couldn't help but notice how subtle it all was, how the shift from wild to human didn't come through force, but through experience, through exposure, through connection. And with each passing moment, Enkidu began to change, not just in what he did, but in how he perceived the world. He started to learn sounds, then words, slowly attaching meaning to them, shaping thoughts in a way he never had before. And with language came awareness. And with awareness came something even heavier, emotion. He began to feel things that couldn't be explained through instinct alone. Joy, curiosity, attachment, and eventually something deeper. Something that would stay with him long after this moment passed. And I found myself sitting with that realization because it made me question something I had always taken for granted. We often think becoming more human means gaining something, knowledge, connection, understanding. But what if it also means losing something in return, something quieter, something simpler, something that can't survive in a world of words and expectations? Because as Enkidu stepped further into this new existence, the animals that once stood beside him, that once trusted him without hesitation, began to move away, slowly, cautiously, as if they could sense the change before he fully understood it himself. And that moment stayed with me longer than anything else in this part of the story, because it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was irreversible, a quiet separation between who he was and who he was becoming. And I couldn't help but feel the weight of it because it mirrored something deeper, something we all experience in different ways, the moment when we move forward but can't go back, when growth demands a price, even if we don't realize it at the time. And that's when the thought finally settled in, clear, undeniable, that maybe becoming human, truly human, isn't just about gaining language or knowledge or connection. Maybe it's also about accepting loss, about letting go of something pure, something effortless, something that once made us feel complete without needing to understand why. And as I sat with that idea, quiet, reflective, I realized something that made this part of the story feel almost personal, because Enkidu wasn't just changing, he was crossing a line, one that all of us cross at some point, leaving behind a simpler version of ourselves in exchange for something more complex, more aware, more human, and maybe, just maybe, that's a trade none of us ever fully understand until it's already been made. And then, just when Enkidu had begun to understand what it meant to be human, when words no longer felt foreign, when emotions started to take shape inside him, something else began to emerge, something quieter, but far more powerful, a direction, because up until that moment, his life had no destination, no purpose beyond living, moving, existing. But now, with awareness came something new, a sense that there was somewhere he needed to go, someone he needed to face. And I found myself thinking about that shift for a long time, because it's strange how the moment we begin to understand ourselves, we also begin to feel pulled towards something beyond ourselves, as if awareness doesn't just give us meaning, it gives us direction. And in Enkidu's case, that direction led to a name he had only just begun to hear whispered: Gilgamesh, a king, a ruler, a man whose strength was said to rival the gods themselves, but also a man whose actions carried weight, heavy enough to be felt even beyond the walls of his city. And I tried to imagine what that must have sounded like to Enkidu, hearing about someone who was both powerful and feared, admired and resented, someone who seemed to stand at the center of everything he was only beginning to understand. And maybe that's what drew him forward, not just curiosity, but something deeper, something instinctive, because even though he had changed, even though he had stepped into the world of humans, there was still something within him that recognized imbalance, something that could sense when strength had turned into excess, when power had drifted too far from its purpose. And I couldn't help but wonder, was this something he chose? Or something he was created to do? Because the closer he moved toward Uruk, the more it felt like inevitability, like two paths that had always been moving toward each other, finally beginning to close the distance. And there was something almost unsettling about that idea, because it suggested that some encounters aren't accidents. They are collisions, moments that have been building long before either side is aware of it. And as Enkidu approached the city, I could almost feel the shift in the atmosphere, the openness of the wild giving way to something heavier, something structured, something controlled, the walls of Uruk rising in the distance, not just as protection, but as a boundary between two ways of existing. And I paused there for a moment, because it felt symbolic in a way I couldn't ignore. Enkidu wasn't just walking toward a city. He was walking toward a confrontation, not just with a king, but with everything that king represented. And began to ask myself a question that stayed with me longer than I expected. What happens when you come face to face with someone who mirrors you in ways you don't understand yet? Someone who carries the same strength, but expresses it differently. Someone who reflects not just who you are, but who you could become. And that question didn't have an easy answer, because part of me felt that this meeting could lead to conflict, that two forces like this would naturally clash, that strength meeting strength would result in a battle that neither could avoid. But another part of me wondered something else, something quieter, something more uncertain. What if the real outcome wasn't about winning or losing at all? What if it was about recognition, about seeing something in the other that forces you to question yourself? And I think that's what made this moment feel so important, not because of what was about to happen, but because of what it represented. A turning point, a question made real, a meeting that would not just change two individuals, but redefine the path of everything that came after. And as I followed Enkidu in my mind, step by step, closer and closer to the gates of Uruk, I realized I was no longer just watching the story unfold. I was waiting for the answer. Because deep down, I needed to know, if you stand face to face with someone who is everything you are and everything you are not, do you fight them or do you change? And maybe, just maybe, that answer is what this entire story has been moving toward all along. And then it finally happened, the moment the entire story had been quietly building toward, not with thunder at first, not with chaos, but with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting, because two forces that had been moving toward each other from completely different paths were now standing face to face. And I remember pausing there, because this wasn't just a meeting. It was something heavier, something inevitable. Enkidu, the man shaped by nature, untouched by power, and Gilgamesh, the king shaped by control, by ambition, by the weight of a throne. And when I imagined them standing there, eye to eye, equal in presence, equal in strength, I felt something shift in the story immediately, because for the first time, Gilgamesh was no longer alone at the top. And that realization carried more weight than any battle could, because when you're used to standing above everyone else, what happens when someone finally stands beside you and doesn't step back? And I could almost feel the tension between them, not just physical, but something deeper, something unspoken, like two reflections staring at each other, trying to understand what they were seeing. And then, without warning, it broke. The silence shattered, and the clash began, not carefully, not hesitantly, but with a force that seemed to shake everything around them, their bodies moving with a kind of raw power that didn't need explanation, every strike carrying weight, every movement precise yet instinctive, as if both of them had been waiting for this moment longer than they realized. And I found myself drawn into it, not because of the violence, but because of what it represented. Because this wasn't just a fight to win, it was something else entirely, a test, a confrontation between two versions of strength, one born from dominance, the other from balance, and the more they clashed, the clearer it became. Neither one was giving ground, neither one was breaking. And that's when it truly hit me. This wasn't like any battle Gilgamesh had faced before. There was no clear superiority, no overwhelming advantage, no moment where he could simply assert control and end it, because Enkidu stood there, unmoved, unafraid, matching him in every way that mattered. And I could almost sense what that must have felt like for Gilgamesh in that moment. Not fear exactly, but something unfamiliar, something unsettling, the realization that he was no longer unmatched. That for the first time in his life, there existed someone who could meet him without hesitation, without submission. And I kept thinking about that because it's one thing to be strong, but it's something entirely different to encounter someone who forces you to question what that strength really means. And as the fight continued, their movements growing heavier, their breaths sharper, their energy beginning to strain against the limits of their bodies, I realized something that felt almost more important than the outcome itself. This moment, this exact moment, was the beginning of change, because no matter how it ended, it could never be undone. Gilgamesh had seen something he couldn't unsee, felt something he couldn't ignore, and I couldn't help but wonder, is this what it takes to break through the illusion of being untouchable? Not defeat, but equality, not losing, but finally being matched. And that thought stayed with me as the clash reached its peak, both of them pushing forward, neither willing to step back until the truth became undeniable. This was no longer a king dominating his world. This was a man standing before another man, realizing for the first time that he was not the strongest anymore, and somehow that moment felt more powerful than any victory he had ever achieved. And what struck me most wasn't the violence, wasn't the force of their blows or the sound of impact echoing through the streets. It was what happened next, because the fight didn't end the way I expected. It didn't build toward a final strike, a decisive moment, a clear victor standing over the other. No. Instead, it stretched on longer than it should have, heavier with each movement, until something began to change, not around them, but within them. And I remember thinking how rare it is to witness a moment where neither side wins, and yet everything still shifts, because as they continued to clash, something subtle began to emerge. Their strength, once used to dominate, was now being tested in a completely different way, not to prove superiority, but to endure equality. And I could almost feel the exhaustion setting in, not just in their bodies, but in something deeper, something that goes beyond muscle and force, because when two people of equal strength collide, the fight becomes less about overpowering the other and more about confronting yourself. And that idea stayed with me, because it made the entire moment feel less like a battle and more like a reflection. Each strike returned, each movement mirrored, as if they were both facing something they had never encountered before, not weakness, but limitation. And I began to wonder, how often do we reach a point like that in our own lives, where no matter how hard we push, no matter how strong we believe we are, we come face to face with something that cannot be overcome through force alone. And I think that's what made this moment so powerful, because it stripped away the illusion of control, of dominance, of certainty, leaving behind something far more real, something far more human. And as the fight slowed, as their movements lost that initial intensity, replaced by something heavier, more deliberate, I realized that neither of them was truly trying to win anymore, not in the way they were at the beginning, because something had shifted, quietly, imperceptibly. Almost imperceptibly, they had begun to understand each other as not through words, not through explanation, but through resistance, through effort, through the shared experience of being pushed to a limit neither had reached before. And I couldn't help but sit with that realization, because it changed everything I thought I knew about strength, because maybe strength isn't proven in victory. Maybe it's revealed in what happens when victory is impossible, when there's no clear outcome, just no resolution that satisfies the need to win, only a moment suspended between two equal forces, forced to confront something deeper than competition. And as they finally slowed, their bodies heavy, their breaths uneven, their energy spent, the truth settled in, quiet, undeniable. There was no winner here, no defeated opponent, no clear end to the struggle, and somehow that felt more significant than any triumph could have been. Because in that space where neither could claim victory, something else had taken its place, something that couldn't be measured in strength or dominance, something that didn't need to be declared, only felt. And I found myself asking a question I hadn't expected, one that lingered long after the moment passed. What if the most important battles in life aren't the ones we win, but the ones that show us? We were never meant to fight in the first place. And then something happened that I didn't expect at all. Something so quiet, so subtle, that if you weren't paying attention, you might miss it completely. Because after all the force, all the tension, all the resistance between them, the fight didn't end with another strike. It ended with a pause, a stillness, a moment where neither of them moved forward. And I remember sitting with that image. Two figures standing across from each other, breathing heavily, bodies worn down. But something in their eyes had changed, something that wasn't there at the beginning. Because the anger, the need to dominate, the instinct to prove superiority, it had faded, replaced by something else entirely. Something I couldn't name at first, but I could feel it. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. It was recognition. Not of weakness, but of equality. And I found myself wondering how rare that is, to look at someone who has just challenged you at your limit. And instead of seeing an enemy, you see something familiar, something that reflects your own strength back at you. And in that moment, something shifted between them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt deeper than the battle itself, because respect, real respect isn't something that can be demanded. It isn't something that comes from titles or power or fear. It's something that emerges when two people meet each other without illusion, without hierarchy, without one standing above the other. And I could almost imagine what that must have felt like for Gilgamesh, someone who had spent his entire life unmatched, unquestioned, suddenly realizing that there exists someone who can meet him exactly where he stands, not below him, not above him, but beside him. And I think that realization alone was more powerful than any victory he had ever known, because it forced him to see something he had never needed to see before, himself, reflected through someone else. And at the same time, I couldn't help but think about Enkidu, someone who had just entered the world of humans, who had only recently begun to understand connection, emotion, meaning, and now stood before a man who embodied everything he had been drawn toward and pushed against at the same time. And instead of continuing the fight, instead of pushing until one of them broke, something else emerged, something that changed the entire direction of the story. They stopped seeing each other as opponents and began to see each other as something far more complex, something far more valuable. And I found myself holding on to that moment, because it felt like a turning point that wasn't built on destruction, but on understanding. And that's when the thought finally formed clearly in my mind: maybe the person who has the greatest impact on your life isn't the one who supports you or agrees with you or makes things easy. Maybe it's the one who challenges you completely, the one who forces you to confront your limits, your assumptions, your identity, the one who doesn't step back when you push forward, and in doing so, reveals something you couldn't see on your own. And I sat with that idea longer than I expected, because it made me look at conflict differently, not as something to avoid, not as something to win, but as something that can transform. If you're willing to see it that way. And as the moment settled, as the tension gave way to something quieter, something steadier, I realized that what had just happened wasn't the end of a fight. It was the beginning of something far more powerful, because in that space, where neither had won, where neither had lost, they had found something else entirely, something that didn't require victory to exist. Something that only emerges when two forces stop trying to overcome each other and start to understand what they are facing. And maybe, just maybe, that's where real change begins. Not in winning, but in finally meeting someone who is strong enough to stand in front of you and not move until you see yourself more clearly than ever before. And after that moment, after the dust had settled, after the force of the clash had faded into something quieter, I expected the story to return to what it was before, to power, to control, to a king reclaiming his place above everyone else, but it didn't. It moved in a direction I hadn't anticipated, something slower, something more subtle, something that didn't announce itself as change, but revealed it piece by piece. And I remember noticing it first in the smallest details, not in grand speeches, not in dramatic declarations, but in the way Gilgamesh began to move through his city, the way he listened, the way he paused, the way he no longer seemed to rush forward with the same relentless force that once defined him. And I found myself wondering what exactly had shifted inside him, because nothing external had taken his power away. He was still the king, still unmatched in strength, still standing at the center of everything, and yet something was different. Something had softened, something had opened, and I couldn't help but connect it back to that moment, that encounter, that realization that he was not alone at the top. Because maybe that's what had been missing all along, not strength, not control, but perspective, the ability to see beyond himself. And as I followed the story further, I began to see the effects ripple outwards, slowly, steadily, like water settling after a storm. The people of Uruk, who once moved with hesitation, with quiet fear in their voices, began to change as well, not instantly, not dramatically, but in ways that felt real. The kind of change that doesn't come from command, but from trust rebuilding over time. Markets that had once been filled with silence began to carry sound again, not loud, not overwhelming, but present, alive. Conversations that were once whispered began to rise just a little higher, as if the air itself felt safer to speak in. And I paused there for a moment, because that kind of transformation, that shift from fear to something closer to ease, isn't something that can be forced. It has to be earned. And that realization stayed with me, because it made me look at Gilgamesh in a completely different way, not as the man he was at the beginning of the story, but as someone standing at the edge of becoming something else. And I started to think about how rare that is, how difficult it is for someone who has lived a certain way for so long to change direction, to question themselves, to step back from patterns that once felt natural. And yet, here it was, unfolding quietly, without spectacle, without the need to prove anything, just a gradual shift toward something more balanced, more aware, more human. And I couldn't help but reflect on that, because it challenged something I hadn't realized I believed, that people don't really change, that once someone reaches a certain point, they stay there, fixed, defined, unable to move beyond what they've become. But this story, this moment, began to suggest something else entirely, something more uncertain, but also more hopeful. That maybe change doesn't come from losing everything. Maybe it comes from encountering something that forces you to see differently and having the choice to respond to that awareness. And as I sat with that idea, watching the city of Uruk slowly come back to life, not because it was commanded to, but because it was allowed to, I felt something shift in my own understanding, because this wasn't just a story about a king becoming better. It was a story about what becomes possible when someone chooses to change, not because they have to, but because they finally can. And I realized quietly, almost unexpectedly, that I was beginning to believe something I hadn't been sure of before, that even someone who has gone too far, who has lost sight of what matters, who has lived in a way that causes harm, might still find a way back. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually, step by step. And that thought stayed with me, steady, grounding, because it didn't just belong to Gilgamesh. It belonged to something much larger, something that reaches into every life in different ways. And for the first time in this story, I felt something I hadn't felt at the beginning, Not fascination, not unease, but something quieter, something more difficult to define, something that felt like the beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, people can change. And just when I thought the story had found its balance, when the city began to breathe again, when the weight of fear slowly lifted from the streets of Uruk, something else began to stir. Something quieter at first, almost easy to ignore. But the more I followed it, the more I realized it carried a different kind of energy. Not the heavy pressure of control, but a restless pull. Something that didn't come from fear, but from within. And I found myself recognizing it immediately. That feeling of wanting more. Not out of need, but out of something deeper. Something harder to explain. Because even though Gilgamesh had begun to change, even though peace had returned to the city, there was still something inside him that refused to settle, something that looked beyond the walls of Uruk, beyond the life he had rebuilt, and asked a question that felt both powerful and dangerous at the same time. What else is out there? And I paused there for a moment, because that question is never as simple as it sounds. It doesn't just open doors, it pulls you toward them, whether you're ready or not. And that's when the idea of the journey began to take shape, not as a necessity, not as something forced upon him, but as a choice. A decision driven by the desire to leave something behind, something that would outlast him. And I remember feeling a shift in myself at that point, because part of me understood it. Understood the need to create something that lasts, to prove that your existence mattered, that you were here, that you did something that wouldn't be forgotten. But another part of me felt uneasy because I had already seen where unchecked ambition could lead. And I couldn't ignore that quiet tension building again, slowly, steadily, as if the story was preparing to move into something darker, something less certain, and the destination of that journey was the Cedar Forest, a place that didn't belong to men, a place that felt almost sacred, untouched, ancient, where the trees rose so high they seemed to hold the sky in place. And I tried to imagine it not just as a location, but as something symbolic, a boundary, a line between what humans are meant to reach and what they are not. And guarding that place was Humbaba, not just a creature, not just an obstacle, but something more, something placed there with intention. A protector, a force meant to preserve what should not be disturbed. And I couldn't help but feel the weight of that, because this wasn't just another challenge. This wasn't just another enemy to defeat. This was something that existed for a reason, something tied to balance, to order, to limits that perhaps were never meant to be crossed. And yet, Gilgamesh chose to go, and Enkidu went with him. Not out of blind ambition, but out of loyalty, out of connection. And I found myself watching that decision unfold with a growing sense of unease. Because this time, the journey didn't feel like growth, it didn't feel like discovery, it felt like something else entirely. Something that walked a thin line between courage and recklessness, between purpose and pride. And I kept asking myself, how do we know when we're chasing something meaningful and when we're simply chasing more? And that question lingered as they moved further from Uruk, further from the safety of what they had rebuilt. Deeper into a place that felt untouched by human will, where every step forward seemed to carry a quiet warning, not loud, not obvious, but present, like the world itself was watching, waiting. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this journey, this pursuit of glory, wasn't just about what they would gain, but about what they might lose along the way. Because sometimes, the victories we seek the most are the ones that cost us more than we ever expected. And when they finally reached the heart of that forest, when the towering cedars closed in around them and the light itself seemed to struggle to break through the canopy above, I could feel the shift immediately. This wasn't a place meant for conquest. It wasn't something that invited human ambition. It felt older, heavier, like stepping into something that had existed long before them and would continue long after. And that's when Humbaba appeared, not as a simple enemy, not as something to be defeated and forgotten, but as a presence that filled the space entirely, something that didn't just guard the forest, but belonged to it, as if the land itself had taken form to stand in their way. And I remember pausing there, because everything about this moment felt different from the battles before. This wasn't about proving strength. This wasn't about dominance. This was something else, something that carried weight beyond the two men standing there. And yet, they moved forward. Gilgamesh with his desire to leave a mark that would last forever, Enkidu beside him, steady, loyal, even though somewhere deep within him there was hesitation, a quiet understanding of what Humbaba truly represented. And then the clash began, but this time, it wasn't balanced. It wasn't equal in the way their fight had been, because something else had entered the moment, something beyond human strength, the intervention of the gods, winds that did not belong to the earth, forces that bent the very space around them. And I couldn't ignore how that changed everything, because suddenly the outcome felt less like a test and more like a decision already made. And as Humbaba struggled, as the force around him began to close in, I found myself watching not just the battle, but the shift in meaning, because this wasn't two men overcoming a challenge. This was two men stepping into something that may not have been theirs to take. And then came the moment that stayed with me the longest, the one I couldn't shake even after it passed. Humbaba weakened, no longer the unstoppable guardian he had been just moments before. Looked at them and spoke, not with rage, not with defiance, but with something that felt almost human, a plea, an offer, a request to be spared. And I remember sitting there, caught in that moment, because everything slowed down, everything narrowed to a single question. What would they do? What would I do if faced with something like that? And Enkidu hesitated. He saw it, the possibility of mercy. The idea that maybe this didn't have to end in destruction, but Gilgamesh, driven by something deeper, something that had been building long before this moment, chose otherwise. And with that decision, it was over. The final blow fell, and Humbaba collapsed, not just as a defeated enemy, but as something that had been removed from the world, something that had a purpose, a role, a place, and I felt it immediately. That quiet shift, that subtle imbalance, because the forest itself seemed to react, not loudly, not violently, but in a way that was almost mournful, the air heavier, the silence deeper, as if something had been lost that could not be replaced. And that's when the thought settled in, not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet discomfort I couldn't ignore. They had won. They had achieved what they set out to do. They had proven their strength, secured their glory, and yet it didn't feel right. It didn't feel complete. It felt like something had been taken rather than earned. And I kept returning to that feeling, trying to understand it. Because on the surface, this was victory. This was exactly what they had wanted. But beneath that, there was something else, something that lingered in the background. Something that whispered a question I couldn't fully answer. What happens when we cross a line we don't fully understand? And as they stood there, victorious, surrounded by the silence of a forest that no longer felt the same, I realized something that would stay with me long after this moment passed, that not every victory brings peace, and sometimes the ones we fight the hardest for are the ones that leave us with the quietest sense that something has gone wrong. And just when I thought the weight of that forest, the silence that followed Humbaba's fall, might be enough to slow things down, the story moved forward again, not into calm, but into something sharper, something more volatile, because victory has a strange way of doing that. It doesn't always settle you. Sometimes it pushes you further, makes you believe you can go even higher, even further. And that's where I felt the shift begin again, when they returned to Uruk, not as men who had faced something sacred, but as heroes, celebrated, admired, lifted even higher than before. And I could almost, how dangerous that moment was. Not outwardly, not obviously, but internally. Because when the world starts to reflect your greatness back at you, it becomes harder to see the limits you might be approaching. And then she appeared, Sentity fictional character Ishtar, Ishtar, with a presence that seemed to bend everything around her, a goddess of beauty, of power, of desire, someone who had never been denied, someone who didn't need to ask twice. And I remember pausing there because this moment felt different from everything that came before. Not a battle, not a test of strength, but something more complex, something tied to choice, to restraint, to understanding consequences beyond the immediate moment, because Ishtar didn't come as an enemy. She came with an offer, one that most would never refuse. Power beyond imagination, status beyond reach, a union that would place Gilgamesh even closer to the divine than he already stood. And for a moment, I could feel the weight of that decision, because it wasn't just about accepting or rejecting. It was about what that choice represented. And when Gilgamesh refused, calmly, firmly, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not relief, but tension, because this wasn't just a rejection. This was a disruption, a break in something that was never meant to be challenged. And I began to wonder, what happens when you deny something that has never been denied before, especially when that something is not human, not bound by the same limits? And the answer came quickly, too quickly, because what followed wasn't negotiation, it wasn't understanding, it was reaction, raw, immediate, and fueled by something far more dangerous than anger, wounded pride. And I could almost feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way everything seemed to tighten, as if the world itself was preparing for what was about to unfold. Because Ishtar didn't simply walk away, she rose, she turned toward the heavens, and she demanded something that carried consequences far beyond a single moment. The bull of heaven, a force not meant to walk among men, a power that didn't just threaten individuals, but entire lands, entire lives. And I remember sitting with that realization, because it felt like the scale of the story had suddenly expanded. This was no longer about two men or even a single city. This was about what happens when the divine itself is drawn into conflict with the human. And I couldn't help but ask myself, where is the line between courage and defiance? Between standing your ground and stepping into something far beyond your control? Because Gilgamesh had made his choice, a choice that on the surface felt justified, even wise. But beneath it, there was something else beginning to unfold, something that couldn't be reversed. And as the sky darkened, as the presence of something immense began to descend toward Uruk, I felt that same quiet unease return, stronger this time, heavier. Because this wasn't just consequence, this was escalation. And I realized in that moment that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the mistake itself, it's what comes after. When one action leads to another, when one decision pulls something greater into motion, and there's no longer a way to stop it, only a way to face it. And maybe, just maybe, this was the point where everything would begin to unravel. And when the bull of heaven finally descended, I could feel it before I could even imagine it. Not just as a creature, but as a force. Something that didn't belong to the world of men. Something that carried the weight of divine anger. And the moment it touched the earth, everything changed. The ground itself seemed to break beneath its steps. The air grew heavier, tighter, as if even the sky was being pulled downward. And I remember thinking, this isn't a battle they chose anymore. This is something that has been unleashed, something that doesn't stop until it has taken what it came for. And as it moved through the land, tearing through fields, splitting the earth open, leaving destruction in its wake, I could almost feel the panic rising within the city. Not the quiet fear from before, but something sharper, something immediate. The kind of fear that forces people to run without knowing where to go, and in the middle of it all, Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood once again, not facing each other this time, but standing side by side, and I paused there, because something about that image felt different. Not just strength meeting strength, but something deeper, something that had been built between them, something that now held under pressure. And as the bull charged, massive, unstoppable, I could feel the scale of what they were facing, because this wasn't Humbaba, this wasn't a guardian tied to the earth. This was something sent from above, something that carried intention, purpose, and consequence, and yet they didn't step back, they moved forward together. And I could see it unfolding in my mind. Enkidu, drawing its attention, moving with that same raw instinct he carried from the wild. While Gilgamesh circled, waiting, watching, searching for an opening that might not even exist. And for a moment, it felt impossible, like they were standing against something that couldn't be overcome, something that wasn't meant to be defeated, but endured. And I found myself holding on to that thought, because it raised a question that lingered beneath everything. Just because you can fight something, does that mean you should? And then, slowly, through force, through coordination, through something that had been forged between them in their earlier clash, they began to turn the tide. Not easily, not cleanly, but gradually, step by step, pushing back against something that should not have been pushed. Until finally, the moment came, that decisive strike, that final act, and the bull fell, its massive form collapsing into the earth. The force of it echoing outward, leaving behind silence, not relief, not celebration, but something else, something heavier, something that settled into the space where sound should have been. And I remember sitting there with that image, two figures standing over something they had just defeated, something sent by the gods themselves. And instead of feeling triumph, I felt a shift, something quiet but undeniable. Because this wasn't just victory anymore. This was defiance, not of an enemy, but of something far greater, something that had now been challenged directly. And I couldn't ignore the weight of that realization, because it changed everything. It wasn't just about what they had accomplished. It was about what they had stepped into, a line that once crossed could not be undone. And I found myself asking a question I couldn't shake. What happens when humans begin to believe they can stand against the forces that shape them? What happens when strength no longer respects the limits it was given? And as that thought settled in, slow, heavy, I felt it clearly for the first time. Not as a distant idea, but as something immediate, something certain. They had gone too far, not in the way that's obvious, not in the way that's easy to judge, but in a deeper sense. A quiet crossing of something that was never meant to be crossed. And I realized in that moment that this victory, this undeniable display of strength, wasn't the peak of their journey. It was the turning point, the place where everything would begin to shift. Not outwardly at first, but inwardly inevitably. Because when you challenge something greater than yourself, the outcome doesn't end with the battle. It continues in ways you don't see coming. And as I sat with that silence, that space left behind after something powerful had fallen, I couldn't help but feel it. That quiet understanding, settling deeper than before, that sometimes the moment you believe you've won is the moment you've already begun to lose something you can't yet see. And after that silence, after the dust had settled around the fallen bull of heaven, after the echoes of victory had faded into something heavier, I felt it again. That quiet shift in the story, not loud, not immediate, but inevitable. Like something had already been set in motion the moment they crossed a line they didn't fully understand. And I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like the end of a battle. It feels like the beginning of something else, something far less visible, but far more permanent, because when humans challenge something greater than themselves, the consequences don't always arrive the way we expect. They don't come crashing down all at once. Sometimes they come slowly, through decisions made far beyond our sight. And that's when the story moved upward, away from the city, away from the lives of men, into something colder, something distant, the realm of the gods. And I tried to imagine that moment, a gathering, not of emotion, not of hesitation, but of judgment. Voices that do not waver, forces that do not question themselves the way we do. Looking down at what had happened, not as a story, not as a struggle, but as an imbalance that needed to be corrected. And I found myself sitting with that idea longer than I expected, because it felt unsettling in a way I couldn't fully explain, that somewhere beyond everything we can see or control, decisions might already be made about us, not based on intention, not based on understanding, but on something larger, something that doesn't bend. And then the choice was made. Not dramatic, not debated endlessly, but clear, direct. One of them must fall. One of them must pay for what had been done. And that moment stayed with me because it didn't follow the logic I expected. It didn't choose the king, the one who had led the charge, the one whose ambition had driven everything forward. No, it chose Enkidu, the one who had once been pure, the one who had been created not to destroy, but to balance. And I remember pausing there because something inside me resisted it. Something felt unfair. Something didn't align with the way we want the world to work, because we like to believe that consequences follow clearly defined lines, that those who act are the ones who pay, that justice is something we can recognize easily. But this moment broke that illusion completely, because here in this story, that wasn't how it worked. And I couldn't stop thinking about that because it forced a question I didn't want to ask. What if life doesn't always punish the one who is most responsible? What if sometimes the cost is carried by someone else? Someone who simply stood too close to the moment when everything changed. And that thought stayed with me, heavy, difficult to ignore, because it reached beyond the story into something more real, something we don't like to admit, that not everything is fair, that not every outcome follows a clear sense of justice. And as I sat with that realization, the weight of it began to settle in more deeply, because Enkidu didn't know it yet, the city didn't know it yet, even Gilgamesh didn't know it yet. But something had already been decided, something that could not be undone, something that would move forward no matter how much anyone tried to resist it. And I felt it clearly in that moment, that quiet certainty, that once a certain line is crossed, sad. The outcome is no longer in our hands. And maybe that's the part that stayed with me the most. Not the punishment itself, but the inevitability of it. The understanding that some consequences don't arrive as chaos, they arrive as certainty, slow, silent, but absolute. And I couldn't help but return to a single thought, one that felt heavier the more I held on to it, that maybe, just maybe, life doesn't always the price to the one who deserves it most. Sometimes it simply takes what it needs to restore a balance we don't fully understand. And then it began. Not with a battle, not with a warning anyone could clearly see, but with something far quieter, far more unsettling. Enkidu, the one who once ran with animals, the one whose strength felt limitless, began to weaken, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a shadow creeping in at the edge of light. And I remember how different this felt from everything that came before, because there was no enemy to face, no force to fight against, no strategy that could change what was happening, just a body that no longer responded the same way, a strength that once seemed unbreakable, now slipping away. And I found myself sitting with that contrast because it didn't feel right. Not after everything they had endured, not after everything they had overcome together, and yet, that's exactly what made it so real. Because this wasn't something they could defeat. This was something they had to witness, something they had to endure. And as Enkidu lay there, his energy fading, his breath growing heavier, the story shifted again. Inward this time, into something darker, something more difficult to look at, because his dreams began to change, no longer filled with open fields and movement and life, but with shadows. With visions of a place where light didn't reach, where voices echoed without form, where everything that once had meaning seemed to dissolve into something distant. And I tried to imagine what that must have felt like, to see that approaching, not as an abstract idea, but as something real, something waiting. And I couldn't help but notice how it changed him, not just physically, but in the way he spoke, the way he reflected, the way he began to question everything that had come before. Because when you stand at the edge of something like that, the past doesn't feel the same anymore. Victories lose their weight, glory fades, and what remains is something far more fragile, something far more honest. And I think that's what made this moment so powerful, because it stripped everything away, leaving only what truly mattered. And in those final moments, Enkidu spoke not as a warrior, not as a figure of strength, but as someone who had lived, who had experienced, who had changed. And I could feel the weight of his words even without hearing them clearly, because they weren't about conquest or achievement. They were about connection, about the journey they had shared, about something that couldn't be measured in victories or losses. And I found myself holding on to that moment, because it felt like the first time the story truly slowed down, the first time it stopped moving forward and simply existed in the present. And beside him, Gilgamesh remained, watching, unable to intervene, unable to change what was unfolding. And that's when it hit me, stronger than anything that had come before. Because this wasn't the king I had seen at the beginning. This wasn't the man who commanded everything around him. This was someone facing something he could not control, something his strength meant nothing against, and I felt that shift deeply, because for the first time I saw him not as a ruler, not as a figure above others, but as a person, standing in front of loss, unable to stop it, unable to protect the one thing that mattered most in that moment. And I couldn't look away from that because it felt too real. Too familiar in a way I couldn't fully explain. That moment when everything you thought you could hold on to slips away, and there's nothing you can do but stay there and witness it. And as Enkidu's voice grew softer, as his strength faded into stillness, as the space between breaths stretched longer and longer, the truth settled in, not suddenly, but with a quiet certainty that couldn't be denied. He was leaving. And there was no way to follow, no way to bring him back. And I remember sitting with that moment, letting it linger, because it carried something I couldn't ignore, something that reached far beyond the story itself, that no matter how strong we become, no matter how much we build, no matter how far we go, there are moments where all of that disappears, where power means nothing, where control doesn't exist, and all that remains is the reality of loss. And I realized quietly, almost unwillingly, that this was the first time I had seen Gilgamesh truly powerless, not defeated by another man, not overcome by force, but faced with something far more absolute, something that no strength could stand against. And in that moment, everything changed. And after that moment, after the final breath had faded, after the stillness settled in where Enkidu once was, something inside Gilgamesh broke, not loudly, not in a way that shook the world around him, but in a way that felt deeper, more permanent, like something fundamental had shifted beneath everything he believed about himself. And I remember feeling that change almost immediately, because the man who once stood above everyone else, the man who feared nothing, who commanded everything, was now standing in front of something he could not move, could not control, could not undo. And that realization didn't just stay in that moment. It spread slowly, quietly into everything that followed. Because grief doesn't end when someone is gone. It transforms. It becomes something else, something heavier, something that lingers. And I could almost feel it taking hold of him, not just as sadness, but as fear. Something sharper, something more immediate, something that reaches beyond the loss itself and points directly at what comes next. And I paused there, because that's when the story changed again. Not outwardly, but inwardly, completely, because this was no longer about what had been lost. It was about what that loss revealed. And what it revealed was something Gilgamesh had never truly faced before. his own end. And I found myself sitting with that idea longer than I expected, because it felt like everything in his life had led up to this moment. Every victory, every act of power, every attempt to rise above others had never actually touched this one truth, that no matter how high he stood, he was still bound to the same fate as everyone else. And I could almost imagine what that realization must have felt like for him, not as a distant thought, but as something immediate, something unavoidable, something that no strength could push away. Because Enkidu had not fallen in battle, had not been defeated by a stronger force, he had simply stopped. And that simplicity made it even more terrifying, because it meant that death didn't need a reason, it didn't need a challenger, and it didn't need to be earned or deserved. It could come quietly, without warning, and take everything with it. And that's when I began to understand what was happening to Gilgamesh, because this wasn't just grief, this was fear in its purest form. Not the fear of losing something, but the fear of becoming nothing. And I could feel how that would unravel everything he thought he knew. Because what does power mean when it cannot stop that? What does strength mean when it cannot protect you from the one thing that comes for everyone? And I kept returning to that question over and over again, because it didn't just it belonged to him, it belonged to all of us. Even if we don't think about it, even if we avoid it, it's always there, somewhere beneath everything else, waiting. And I realized something in that moment that I couldn't ignore. Because if someone like Gilgamesh, someone who stood closer to the gods than any ordinary man, someone who had everything the world could offer, if even he could be brought to this point, to this fear, to this collapse, then what does that say about the rest of us? And that thought stayed with me, heavier than anything that came before, because it stripped away the distance between the story and reality. It made everything feel immediate, personal, unavoidable. And I found myself asking a question that didn't have an easy answer, one that lingered long after the moment had passed. If even the strongest among us cannot escape what is coming, if even those who seem closest to something greater still fall the same way, then what are we really holding on to? And as I sat with that question, quiet, unsettled, I realized that this was the true breaking point of the story. Not the battles, not the victories, not even the loss itself, but the moment when everything you thought protected you is revealed to mean nothing at all. And for the first time, I saw Gilgamesh not as a king, not as a legend, but as something far more familiar, someone standing in the face of the one thing no one can outrun, and realizing that he cannot escape it either. And maybe, just maybe, that's the moment where the story becomes real for all of us. Because if even he is afraid, then what about us? And so, with that fear taking hold of him, not fading, not softening, but growing stronger with every passing moment, Gilgamesh did the only thing left that still felt possible. He ran, not away from the world, but towards something he believed might still hold an answer. And I remember how different this felt from everything that came before, because this wasn't a journey for glory. It wasn't driven by ambition. Of course, it was driven by something far more urgent, far more desperate, the need to escape what he had just seen, what he had just felt, the realization that death was no longer a distant idea, but something real, something waiting. And I could almost feel the shift in him, the king who once sought to conquer the world, now seeking to outrun something he could not even touch. And that's when the path led him to a name that stood outside everything else, entity, fictional character, Utnapishtim H, the only one granted something no one else could claim. And I paused there, because that idea alone felt almost impossible, that somewhere in this world, there existed someone who had crossed that boundary and not returned. And I could understand why Gilgamesh would cling to that hope. Because when fear becomes real enough, even the smallest possibility can feel like salvation. And so he went across lands that no longer felt familiar, through spaces that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of what he had known, passing through darkness that wasn't just physical, but something deeper, something that felt like the edge of the world itself. And I found myself following that journey, not as a series of steps, but as something internal. Because with each challenge, each obstacle, it felt like he was moving further away from the man he had been and closer to something else, something uncertain, something that no longer believed in strength the same way. And when he finally reached Utnapishtim, when he stood before the one figure who seemed to hold the answer he had been chasing, I expected something different, something dramatic, some revelation that would break everything open, but what came instead was something quieter, something far more difficult to accept. Because Utnapishtim did not offer him a path. He did not show him a way forward. He simply told him the truth, a truth that didn't bend, didn't soften, didn't change just because someone wanted it to, that what he had been seeking was never meant for him, that immortality was not something to be taken, not something to be earned through effort or will, but something given once, under circumstances that could never be repeated. And I remember sitting with that moment because it felt like everything had led here. Every step, every loss, every question, only to arrive at an answer that offered no escape, no solution, no way around what had already been set in place. And I could almost feel the weight of that realization pressing down, because it meant that everything he had feared, everything he had tried to outrun was still there, unchanged, waiting. And I found myself asking something quietly, almost reluctantly. What do you do when the answer you were searching for doesn't exist? When the thing you believed might save you was never real to begin with? And that question stayed with me longer than anything else in this part of the story. Because it didn't just belong to him, it belonged to something deeper, something we all face in different ways. That moment when we realize that some things cannot be avoided, cannot be overcome, cannot be escaped. And for the first time, the journey wasn't about finding something new. It was about understanding something that had always been there. And as I sat with that realization, slowly, quietly, I began to see the story differently again, not as a failure, not as an ending, but as something else entirely. Because maybe the point was never to find a way to live forever. Maybe the point was to understand what it means to live at all. And I realized, almost unexpectedly, that the answer he had been chasing from the very beginning had been shifting the entire time, from strength to control to fear, and now, finally, to meaning. And I couldn't help but hold on to that thought, because it felt like the only thing that remained after everything else had fallen away, that maybe, just maybe, the answer was never about escaping death, but about facing it and choosing how to live anyway. Because in the end, no matter how far we go, no matter what we achieve, no matter how much we try to hold on to, there is only one thing we can truly leave behind. Not power, not control, not even time, but the way we lived while we had it. And maybe, just maybe, that is the only form of immortality we were ever meant to have.